I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. Do you ever feel overwhelmed by the cynicism and violence that's so widespread? Can compassion counteract anxiety and despair? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Political discourse has become increasingly divisive. It's not hard to feel compassion for someone you love, but can you learn to exercise compassion for someone who holds completely different views?
Holiday parties often bring together people with divergent perspectives. Is it possible to interact in a meaningful way without getting into a fight? What about family members who may have said or done something hurtful? Can forgiving them help us heal?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, the science of compassion.
First, the news.
In the People's Pharmacy health headlines. For decades, nutrition experts have been claiming that a calorie is a calorie, no matter what food provides it. A well-done study in the BMJ has just thrown the dogma that all calories are equal into question. The researchers recruited 164 overweight individuals from Framingham, Massachusetts, who had just lost 12% of their body weight on a low-calorie diet supplied by the researchers. They provided these volunteers with their meals, with the calories adjusted to maintain that weight loss. Participants were randomly assigned to take meals with 60%, 40%, or 20% of their calories from carbohydrate sources. Protein was held constant at 20% of calories in all three experimental diets. The investigators arranged for all the meals to be provided, thus bypassing individual variations that occur when people fend for themselves. They assessed energy expenditure very accurately using radioactive labeled water.
By the end of the 5-month trial, people in the low-carb diet group were using significantly more energy than those in the high-carb diet group. The difference came out to approximately 200 calories a day. If a person used 200 calories more than they ate every day, they could potentially lose more than 20 pounds in 3 years. The researchers report that the energy expenditure on the low-carb diet was highest for those who had high insulin levels when the study began. The hormones ghrelin and leptin, which regulate hunger and fat storage, were also lower among the individuals on the low-carb regimen. These results offer hope that a strict low-carb diet could help increase energy expenditure and potentially help people trying to lose weight.
Cognitive tests can help diagnose approximately 70% of people with Alzheimer's disease. Although scientists don't yet have good drugs to prevent this devastating dementia, they are studying other sorts of interventions that may be helpful if the condition can be diagnosed before too much brain damage has occurred. Investigators at Washington University report that a particular type of MRI, called diffusion tensor imaging, can detect 90% of people with Alzheimer's disease years before they show clinical symptoms. Diffusion tensor imaging reveals the brain's white matter by looking at how water molecules move within the brain. There were 61 individuals in this study, with approximately half of them ultimately developing Alzheimer's disease.
Men who want to maintain their memory in good condition do well to load their plates with colorful vegetables and berries. Harvard researchers have been following more than 25,000 male health professionals for at least 20 years, asking them about their diets and health every few years. The men were about 50 when the study began. As it ended, their average age was 73. By the end of the study, about 55% of the volunteers had good memory and cognitive ability. About 38% tested out as average, and 7% had impaired memory and ability to think. The men who had habitually eaten the most vegetables, about 6 servings a day, were 34% less likely than those who ate the least vegetables to have experienced cognitive decline. Orange juice drinkers were also protected. Those who drank it every day were 47% less likely to have impaired cognition than those who drank it just once a month or less. That's a relative risk, The difference in absolute terms is 6.9% of OJ lovers losing mental acuity compared to 8.4% of those who didn't usually drink juice. This study shows an association rather than a cause and effect relationship. Nonetheless, the results suggest that it might be smart to eat your vegetables.
The ongoing saga of contaminated valsartan continues. In July, European drug regulators recalled Chinese-made valsartan because it was contaminated with a probable carcinogen. The FDA followed with its own recall. Eventually, more than a dozen companies had valsartan removed from the marketplace because of carcinogens. The raw material for most of these products originated from the Zhejiang Huahai Pharmaceuticals. Now, a U.S. generic drug company, Mylan, is recalling many lots of its valsartan because they contain the potentially cancer-causing chemical NDEA. The European Union is recalling Mylan's valsartan made in Hyderabad, India. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. How do you react when you see an animal or a young child in distress? Most of us respond automatically with compassion to the suffering of the defenseless.
How about people who differ from us? Can we learn how to be compassionate to those with whom we disagree?
To help us answer that question, we turn to Dr. Kelly McGonigal. She's a health psychologist and lecturer at Stanford University. You may have heard us speak with her before about her books, The Willpower Instinct and The Upside of Stress. Dr. McGonigal offers compassion cultivation training through the Stanford Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. Dr. Kelly McGonigal, it's so nice to talk to you again.
It's great to be back. I always enjoyed these conversations.
Dr. McGonigal, we're really looking forward to talking with you about the science of compassion. But I need to start off by saying, isn't that an oxymoron? I mean, compassion is a term that seems to refer to emotional or spiritual qualities. Is there really any science around it?
There is an amazing growing field of neuroscience and psychology about compassion. And I will say, I get this a lot. People have sometimes accused science of trying to suck the heart out of compassion. But what I love about the science of compassion is that it actually can empower us to be more skillfully open-hearted and to be more effective in how we help others and take care of ourselves. So the science is kind of a roadmap to being better at compassion and really inspiring more effective compassion. It's not about trying to take the heart out of it.
Well, I have to say that it seems as if, just, from looking around these days, that with our politics being what they are, our economics, our sports, all of these interactions, that if anything, we become less compassionate than perhaps we were 100 years ago. So maybe we should start by getting a better understanding of what you mean when you say compassion. Can you define it, please?
Yeah, so compassion is a response to suffering that's rooted in a desire to relieve suffering. And it includes the belief that you can do something to make a difference. It includes the courage to act. And it even includes a warm glow that you get from connecting with others, maybe from knowing that you had a positive impact in the world. And certainly we have other instincts to respond to suffering, instincts like anger or grief, sadness, overwhelm, anxiety. And it is probably the case that many of us are feeling those competing instincts a lot rather than free-flowing compassion, whether it's because it's harder to see or believe that we can make a difference as individuals, or whether it's harder to see and care about the suffering of others, maybe if we're suffering so much in our own lives. So again, I feel like the science can really point a way to help us overcome some of the more destructive instincts that definitely are on the rise, even among people who hold compassion as a strong value.
I wonder if there's a male-female thing going on here. I mean, we tend to generalize and say, oh, yeah, women, they're more compassionate than men. And I remember speaking to a psychologist who was born in Brazil about a year or two ago, and he said, well, there was just one emotion in our family, anger for the guys. That was how men expressed their feelings, by getting angry. Compassion just wasn't part of the mix. So is there a kind of difference between men and women?
You know, there are some differences, but I want to say that there are a lot of different flavors of compassion. There's heroic compassion and brave compassion. You see that in both sexes. There is that kind of maternal compassion that often gets associated more with women, although men do show it. We know that testosterone can sometimes interfere with the biology of compassion, which is driven largely by hormones like oxytocin. So you could imagine in some scenarios there being a conflict, but in general, you do not see in the research, if you ask people, do you care about others? Are you motivated to help? And particularly also, do you benefit? You know, does it make your heart glad? Does it improve your health when you are compassionate? No gender differences there either. Sometimes it just manifests in different forms, or maybe perhaps the circle of compassion, who it is that we care most about helping.
Well, let me ask you then, since you have raised the question, does it make you feel better to practice compassion?
It does. But if it's the type of compassion that really has that full upward spiral that I described, the one that includes the belief that you can make a difference, that sense of connecting with other people, the warm glow, there are other things that people sometimes mistake for compassion, like empathic distress, where you just sort of feel for the sadness of others or feel for the suffering of others in a way that's more like contagious stress. That's not always as good for our health. But certainly there is a lot of research showing that this full, rich experience of compassion where you do help, you do connect, and you do enjoy that warm glow of satisfaction. It can do everything from boost the immune system in the short term to actually, it seems to prevent what we usually associate as the inevitable consequences of chronic stress in terms of diseases or even mortality.
Now, Dr. McGonigal, I understand that you had an experience on an airplane that has something to do with this topic. Would you explain that, please?
Yeah, so it's an interesting story that I often tell when I'm trying to help people understand the different dimensions of compassion. And I want to say up front, this is not some great story about my deep or effective compassion. In that way, it's actually not a great example. But the reason that this story often resonates is because it shows how powerfully we can snap into the compassionate instinct. So this happened a couple of years ago when I was on a plane going to Denver from New York City. And I hate flying. We've probably talked about this in the past at some point. I mean, I have a terrible fear of flying. Very few things stress me out as much. So anytime I'm on an airplane, I'm in a miserable state of mind. I'm in that sort of fight or flight, dread state. And I was feeling some small relief because the seat next to me was empty. And I was thinking, okay, I'm going to have a little bit more breathing room. You know, this is going to be okay. And at the very last minute, this guy comes onto the airplane and slides into that seat. And I'm feeling a little bit of resentment already for the stranger I don't know. And, we make eye contact and then we, prepare to go our separate ways for this multi-hour flight. And throughout the flight, I'm hating it as much as I usually do. I'm in that state of fear. And at some point, the man sitting next to me, he gets a phone call, which I'd never seen before. And in that state of sort of, resenting him, I remember rolling my eyes at one of the flight attendants. And we were like, oh, can you believe this guy taking a phone call? And after a minute or so, he puts his phone on his tray table and he bursts into animalistic sobs, heaving, wailing, like I have only heard a couple of times in my life. And immediately everything shifts. Everyone nearby is paying attention to him. He drops his head into his hands and I just feel my heart pounding even more, trying to figure out what is happening because in the moment it's not clear. It was profoundly unsettling. And after a minute or two, he lifts his head and he says, I just found out that my son is brain dead. And he had actually raced onto this airplane because he had found out that his son had been in an accident, and he was racing to the hospital to get to him. So he had just found out that he would not be able to see his son fully alive again. And everything in my physiology shifted at this moment. What had been a heart pounding in fear, I suddenly was flooded with the sense of enormous warmth and expansion around my physical heart. And this man I'd felt this irritation toward, the stranger, there was just love of an immediate and deep intensity. And the flight attendants were trying to figure out how to deal with the situation pragmatically. But I remember turning to him and just feeling so desperately like I wanted to do something to relieve his suffering. I remember wanting to touch him and asking if I could give him a hug or hold his hand. We talked a little bit about his son. He kept saying that, there's nothing you can say. There's nothing anyone can say. And I sensed that he wanted some privacy. So I kind of turned away and out toward the window, and I started doing a compassion meditation that is a visualization of breathing in another person's suffering and transforming it in your heart so you can breathe out compassion, strength, love, or hope. And I did that meditation to give him some privacy, but still this desire to feel like there was something I could do to give him some dignity or some peace in this incredibly horrific moment where he's now trapped on an airplane and can't even be by himself or with loved ones in this moment. And the thing that makes it, and of course, there was nothing I could do, so it's not a great story of actually relieving his suffering. It's not that kind of compassion. But what I remember being so stunning is that my fear went away, like I've never experienced on any flight before or after. And there was no fear present. There could not be fear present in such a strong physiological mind-body state of compassion. And I've never had an experience quite like that before or again. And the reason I often tell that story is sometimes people think compassion is kind of soft and fuzzy, or it's like a mellow state. One of the things we know about the physiology, both in the brain and in the rest of the body, is that compassion is an incredible state of courage. And when you are that connected and that motivated to relieve the suffering of others, often it feels much more positive than people expect. And at the same time, it doesn't feel anywhere near as, I want to say like quiet as people often assume when they hear the word compassion, and they think about just someone sort of softly, beaming in some state of mindful peace. There's real energy to it, but it's brave energy.
You're listening to health psychologist Kelly McGonigal. She lectures at Stanford University and offers compassion cultivation training through the Stanford Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. Dr. McGonigal studies how social connection can promote health, happiness, and resilience. Her books include The Willpower Instinct and The Upside of Stress.
We need to take a short break. When we come back, we'll learn about compassion collapse.
You'll also find out more about the biology of compassion.
How does compassion affect your immune system?
Should we learn about compassion in kindergarten?
We'll also consider how to find compassion for people with different perspectives and politics than ourselves.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy podcast is sponsored in part by Kaya Biotics. Kaya Biotics offers the first probiotics which are both certified organic and hypoallergenic.
All probiotics are produced in Germany under laboratory conditions with high-quality ingredients and under strict regulatory oversight.
The 3 available formulas are created for very specific purposes, such as strengthening the immune system, fighting yeast infections, and helping with weight loss.
To learn more about Kaya Biotics probiotics and the important topic of gut health, you can visit their website, KayaBiotics.com. That's Kaya Biotics.com. Use the discount code PEOPLE for $10 off your first purchase.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Red-X Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
If you would like to purchase a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1104. That number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com. You can also download the podcast from iTunes.
Today we're exploring compassion. Are some people better at this than others? Can it be learned? Our guest is Dr. Kelly McGonigal, health psychologist and lecturer at Stanford University. She's author of The Willpower Instinct and The Upside of Stress.
Dr. McGonigal, your story about the airplane flight is quite extraordinary and very touching and powerful. And I think a lot of people, when they contemplate compassion, they think about lots of people suffering. You know, a famine in an African nation, civil war in an undeveloped country, a natural disaster. And they're sort of trying to have this sort of mass compassion for tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people. And it's somewhat separated from like an individual. I mean, we can relate to one person at a time, it seems. And so your description of riding on the flight with the gentleman whose son had become brain dead is so extraordinary because it's one person sitting next to another person in great pain. How do we deal with these large-scale disasters where it's so many people we have a hard time relating?
Yes, I mean, you've perfectly described something that psychologists call compassion collapse. So there is no doubt that we evolved this compassionate instinct to respond to suffering that is in front of us when we have an opportunity to act. You know, maybe it's someone in our family, someone in our local community. And nowadays we're exposed to suffering on a scale where we alone are not the cause of the suffering and cannot be the solution to the suffering, even though there may be a role that we can play. And often what happens is when people become aware of that scale of suffering, all of the biological engine of compassion begins to shut down. You can actually watch it happen in people's brains, where the systems of the brain that trigger that kind of empathic distress, that caring, that wanting to relieve suffering, and especially the system of the brain, the reward system that makes you feel like there's something you can do to make a difference. You can watch it slowly shut down, become inhibited as people contemplate the scale of enormous suffering like natural disasters or famine or war. And this can be a real problem because then people start to shut down and disengage when they could make a difference. And they sometimes even disengage so much that they don't realize, even if there's not something I can do for that large-scale suffering, I might be able to pivot and point that compassionate energy closer to home. Maybe there's one small action I can take. Another thing that often happens is people start to lose the ability to savor when they have made a difference. You know, so I'll give a simple example. For a recent natural disaster, thinking about the scale of suffering that was happening, I became aware that one of the organizations I work with, an animal rescue organization, was going to go and try to help reunite lost and abandoned animals with their guardians. And I thought, well, that's something I care about. That's something that I can do. And I know the people who are doing that. I'm going to give some money towards that specific effort. And they sent an email later out that I got showing an actual reunion where I saw one woman and one man be reunited with one dog. And it was so heartwarming. And it was important for me to practice savoring that so that I know the next time there's a natural disaster and there actually is something I can do, that to remember that moment of seeing the impact that I can have through small actions that means the entire world to one individual who's helped by it. And I feel like this is one of the key strategies when we're talking about trying to strengthen compassion, is to find a way to hold awareness of big suffering in your mind and heart and then shrink your attentional focus to a sort of a right-sized act of compassion, the scale at which you can serve, and to know, again, that you alone aren't the cause and you alone won't be the solution. But there's often something you can do, and if you don't know what it is, then just redirect that energy closer to home and don't let it go to waste and don't let yourself shut down.
Dr. McGonigal, you've mentioned a few times the biology of compassion, and I'd like to ask you some questions about that biology. I understand that you have spoken about some studies that demonstrate that practicing compassion has an impact on our immune system. Could you please tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, well, one study that I love is actually one of the first studies looking at this. It was done by the HeartMath Institute, and they just had people think about someone they care about and focus on the area around their heart. I mean, you could do this literally now, just listening to me, to bring some awareness to the area around your heart. I often tell people it's that part of the body where if you were to put your hand on your chest, you might feel a little bit of expansion when you breathe in, and that expansion dissolving when you breathe out. So people did that for 5 minutes while also thinking about someone they really care about or love. And the researchers found that it actually boosted immune functioning immediately and lasted for between 1 to 5 hours, depending on the participant. And they were particularly looking at a type of immune response that allows you to fight off infections. And there are other studies showing similar things. So for example, one study found that people who hugged someone at least once a day, if they then snorted a cold virus, intentionally trying to infect themselves, they were significantly less likely to become sick. And we see this sort of evidence that when you are regularly feeling compassion or caring for others, that your body assumes that you're going to be engaged in the world in a way that might expose you to things that could make you sick. And your body shifts into a state to protect you. It wants you to be healthy and strong for all that caring and all that helping and connecting you're going to do. And one way is to contrast this with the immune state that your body will often put you in if you have a more antagonistic attitude toward the world, more hostile or more cynical. In that case, your immune system also can get boosted, but in the direction of inflammation, as if it's preparing you for battle. And we know that that sort of change actually increases people's risks of all sorts of illnesses and even more serious diseases. So you can think of compassion as being sort of the antitoxin or the antidote to the way that that stress can sometimes negatively impact our immune system.
Well, speaking of how that stress can negatively impact us, Dr. McGonigal, I have been in situations where I've heard someone in distress, and it's often a young child, maybe crying on an airplane, 4 seats over, and it drives me crazy. Not because I'm upset because of the noise, but I'm upset because the child is in such distress. Or perhaps I'm in a supermarket and a parent is chastising a child, and it makes me really uncomfortable. And I want to do something, but sometimes there's not much you can do, especially on an airplane when a child is crying and in distress. So how do we deal with this reverse problem of compassion that is not able to take action?
Yeah, this is a great question. One thing I want to point out is that this is not a problem, right? This is the biological basis of empathy. And if you look at people who have committed their entire lives to compassion, if you look at, say, Buddhist monks who've trained in compassion meditation for 10 to 50,000 hours, and they're viewed as the embodiment of compassion in their communities, if you put them in a brain imaging scanner and you expose them specifically to the sounds of a baby crying, you will see they have just the kind of distress that you pointed out. Their heart rates increase, their pupils dilate. You see activation in areas of the brain that are associated with distress and empathy, and even the amygdala, right, which is that part of the brain that starts an empathy or stress response. And what seems to distinguish people who are really skilled in compassion is that is not the end of the experience. That first sort of stress response, that stress contagion, where you might feel your heart race, you feel that irritation, you feel that sympathetic shared state of distress, somehow they're able to shift their attention to the desire for the one who is suffering to be happy, to be well, to know peace. And often they've done this through compassion meditation practices where you literally practice this. You might imagine or actually expose yourself to someone who's suffering. And when you sense that internal distress, you say in your own mind, may you be happy. May you know peace. May you be healthy. May you be free from this suffering. And again, going back to those brain imaging studies show that this does not take 50,000 hours of practice. Some studies that have been done at the Max Planck Institute in Germany found that 1 day of training in compassion meditation changed people's brain responses to other people's distress in a way that increased their positive emotions. Say when you hear another person crying, it doesn't dilute the distress entirely, but it makes people feel more connected. It makes them feel more hope. It makes them feel less overwhelmed by that distress, even if there's still nothing they can do about it. And so, what I would say is if you're one of those people who feel like you really catch other people's distress, is to put that tool in your back pocket. That when you notice that empathic distress arising, you might just take a moment, take a breath, and think in your own mind, may you know peace or may you be happy. And let yourself smile a little bit by connecting to that desire. It's not really our job to go out and relieve everyone's suffering in every situation, but this is one way to work with your own distress. And studies show that in moments when you really should act, the ability to do this empowers you and gives you that courage so that maybe when it is time to step in and do something, that you will not be overwhelmed by your own distress.
This sounds like something we should all learn, and maybe it should be taught in kindergarten.
Oh, okay, so I agree. First of all, we should all learn this. But this often comes up, and I want to say something really important about how children learn compassion. Because although I believe everyone should learn it, the best predictor of whether or not children develop empathy and compassion is whether they are the recipients of it, not whether they have been taught how to do it, and not whether they've been told that it matters. Literally, the best predictors are the primary adults in their lives, people who are responsive and caring, and do they have a basic kind of social safety among peers? So say as opposed to being strongly bullied or isolated. And because compassion is a natural instinct, when you put someone in those types of positive social interactions, compassion often flourishes. And I would say that, when people ask me, how do we teach this to young children? I would always say, well, first, let's work with the parents and with the teachers so that there is a sort of compassionate space in which children can flourish. And then you go in and teach some of these skills. But it's interesting, it's not just kids. It's really all of us. We mentioned earlier that compassion may be on the decline. And I really think that for many people who just cannot experience compassion in everyday life, it's because they feel like they are not receiving it from others. And it's a sense of being disrespected, of having their own needs not met, of feeling isolated or lonely. And when you are not the recipient of compassion, it's really hard. And so it's another reason for those of us who feel like we have some access to it to keep channeling it out into the world, knowing that it can actually help other people touch their own compassion as well.
Dr. McGonigal, we talked a little bit about the idea that we live in a world of, it seems like animosity has become a key emotion. Anger, our politics have divided us. And I've heard from people who say, I don't want to go home for the holidays because there'll be arguments over politics. Cousin Charlie will be there and he and I just don't agree on anything. Or maybe Dad, and maybe he doesn't like my lifestyle and he's going to complain or criticize and he's going to make me angry. And that's going to lead to fights, and it's just going to be a really unpleasant situation. And so a lot of people just aren't even getting together with family or even what were friends for a long period of time. So how do we defuse those situations, and how do we begin to be compassionate to people who may have different philosophies, perspectives, politics than we have?
Yeah. So let's start with the definition of compassion, which is to relieve suffering. And I think if you always check in with that motivation, you can begin to ask yourself, okay, if I go into this situation and my motivation is to experience less suffering myself and to not inflict suffering on others, and maybe even, you mentioned politics, maybe I have some global commitment to reducing suffering in the world, some social justice or political philosophy, and that matters too. To go into the situation and really think about what it means to not be sort of heaping suffering onto suffering that's already present through, trying to bait people into arguments, or really allowing yourself to take personally every single comment that someone says that may not be personal. And one of the things that we teach at the Stanford Compassion Cultivation Training is a phrase, just like me, which is really helpful in diffusing situations where you feel yourself being triggered because of anger or injustice, unfairness, feeling rejected, feeling irritated. All those difficult emotions is to look at the person who has triggered it, or maybe even to think about the population, a community that has triggered this feeling in you, and to say to yourself, just like me, this person wants to be happy and free from suffering. And just like me, this person sometimes suffers. And what's interesting about this is, first of all, it's true. It's true no matter who the target is. And yet you will know that this is the right exercise for you if there's a voice in your head that says, well, they're not suffering in the right way yet, or they haven't suffered like I have, or, well, they're not paying attention to my suffering. When you feel those feelings come up, this is exactly the right exercise or mindset to try to bring to a situation, because it literally diffuses tension, where you can see the common humanity of another person, even if you believe they also are doing harm, or even if you don't see eye to eye. And studies show that this level of seeing someone else's humanity, it unlocks the ability to have greater empathic accuracy, so you actually will be able to understand their perspective more, which can be very helpful, because often we amplify and assume worse motives than other people have, when they may simply have different experiences or different knowledge base, and they don't necessarily have malevolent intentions. And so you have more accuracy, you can hear them more clearly, you can connect more effectively. And if part of your goal is to change hearts and minds, you also have more opening to do that, but in a way that's not based as much on your own anger or feeling triggered. So I've gotten so much positive feedback about that statement. By the way, the just like me, I would really encourage anyone, if they're hearing it and they feel a little skeptical about it, to me that's the number one sign that it's the right exercise. And I would encourage people to try it and see what happens, see what softens, see what becomes available to you in that moment.
You're listening to Dr. Kelly McGonigal, health psychologist and lecturer at Stanford University. Her books are The Willpower Instinct and The Upside of Stress.
After the break, we'll hear about another example of how to apply the just like me approach.
How can we practice forgiveness?
Is it possible to exercise compassion towards those who have hurt us?
Find out about a compassion project in prisons.
You'll also learn how compassion is linked to end-of-life care.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Red X Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Foot Cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel utterly soft and smooth. 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
To purchase a CD of today's show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1104. That number again, 800-732-2334. You can also download the free podcast from iTunes or from our web store.
Today on the People's Pharmacy, we're discussing compassion and forgiveness. Have you ever been hurt by a friend or family member? Has it left a lasting scar? Holidays can be stressful if you have to hide anger or resentment. How can you learn to forgive in such a situation?
Our guest is Dr. Kelly McGonigal. She is a health psychologist and lecturer at Stanford University. You may have heard us speak with her before about her books, The Willpower Instinct and The Upside of Stress. Dr. McGonigal offers compassion cultivation training through the Stanford Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education.
Dr. McGonigal, the idea of realizing that someone else is just like me seems appealing, but it's a little bit abstract. I wonder if you can tell us about a time when you put that into practice.
Sure. So all of us have individuals that are difficult for us to feel compassion for in specific moments. And I can tell you about one that's been really challenging for me. And it's almost embarrassing to admit to because I'm a health psychologist. We've talked before, part of what I do is I help people make health changes, including things like quitting smoking. And because in my own life, I've had family members and close friends die of lung cancer and smoking-related diseases. I have this thing now where often if I'm walking by someone who's smoking on the street, my very first instinct is this kind of rage where I do not see their full humanity. And it's a very complicated emotional reaction that's tied up in sitting in hospice care with someone dying of lung cancer. And it is not a healthy emotion for me to have, and it completely dehumanizes the other person where I fly into this how can you do this? Don't you know? And you're just poisoning everyone around you and yourself and all that stuff. And I have to catch myself. And in that moment while I'm walking by the stranger I've suddenly made up all sorts of stories about, and I'm experiencing the toxic state of anger, I will literally say to myself, just like me, this person wants to be happy and free from suffering. And it's so obvious that it's true. And I don't have to make up complicated stories. That's what's so great about this practice is I don't need to know why. I don't need to imagine that people had difficult childhoods or they're having a particular type of bad day. It's just true that we all experience every flavor of suffering at some point in our lives if we're lucky enough to live that long. And that's what I mean by doing this practice is it's the practice when you notice that you yourself are triggered. And it's a way to shift from the way that we poison ourselves by allowing ourselves to be triggered in a way that dehumanizes others and makes us fester in our own toxic stew of anger or feeling, victimized by others. So that would be an example.
Well, this sort of goes hand in glove with forgiveness because, there are people who have caused us harm, who have hurt us in some way. And not uncommonly, we replay the hurt and we ruminate over those painful events and probably end up making them worse. So how do we learn how to forgive? How do we learn to be compassionate to those who have harmed us in some pretty powerful way?
This is such a great question because there's a really interesting relationship between forgiveness and compassion. And before I give the how, I kind of want to explain the why. There are a lot of different responses we can have to suffering, and a common one when someone has caused harm is to want to increase the suffering in the world by punishing the person who caused harm. And I'm not saying that is never a legitimate motivation. But compassion is about reducing suffering. And often when we are really angry, the one who is suffering the most is us. It is not the person we are angry at who may have never cared. They've gone on in their own world. Our own anger might not actually change their behavior or prevent future suffering. So often forgiveness, as it relates to compassion, is about looking at the suffering that you have the most control over and that is deserving of being reduced, and that is your suffering. So that's one way to think about the why. Actually, I would love to tell you about this study that, to me, it's one of the classic studies of forgiveness, how it gets done, that points to how this is really an act of self-compassion. And this was a study that was done at a veterans hospital among people who all had been diagnosed with some kind of heart disease, maybe that had a heart attack or they were at risk of a heart attack. And everyone in the study, they went through a classic stress test. And this is where they inject a radioactive substance in your arm. It travels into your bloodstream and it makes its way to your heart so that the researchers can see how healthy your heart tissue is, how much blood is flowing to your heart. And we know that in heart disease, one of the causes of heart disease is insufficient blood flow to your heart. So what this study did is they asked people to tell the story of their greatest hurt. And maybe you can imagine in your own life, like the pain that you carry with you or the anger or resentment. And they asked people to actually tell this story while they looked at blood flow to the heart. And what they found is that when people are rehearsing the hurt in this way, you can actually see cold spots and dark spots form on the heart that is literally reducing blood flow to the heart in ways that increase your risk of having a future heart attack. Okay, so that's just the setup. Then everyone in the study did a forgiveness training where they were encouraged to think about and really acknowledge the pain that they had experienced, and also to think about the person who caused the harm as just a human being, not as sort of all-controlling or all-evil, but maybe as someone who also had suffered in some way, that maybe they are on their own journey, and that it is possible that they could change in positive ways that would lead to less harm in the world in the future. And to try to find a way of thinking about the situation that softens that anger, to acknowledge your own pain, but also begin to let go and even wish for the person who harmed you that they could learn and grow and that their lives could change in ways that would prevent them from causing future harm to others. That's the kind of compassionate response or forgiveness. And they did this multi-week class in trying to get to that place. Then the participants came back in, they did the stress test again, they told the story again, they rehearsed the hurt again. And this time, there were far fewer dark spots or cold spots on their heart as they told this story, that they had transformed their own experience of anger in a way that was literally healing their own physical hearts. And I love this study because it suggests how forgiveness can be an act of self-compassion. And the way that they did it is basically the way to do it, to start to tell yourself a story about your pain that does not deny your suffering, but that begins to see the humanity of the person who caused the harm, and rather than wishing them to suffer as much as possible, to hope for them that they could experience some kind of relief from their own pain and suffering that would allow them to experience positive change and to ultimately lead to greater peace or happiness in the world.
That's really quite striking that you could actually see the difference on an image of the heart.
I know.
That's really amazing.
It's phenomenal. It's so concrete. And I feel like, we started this conversation talking about why the science of compassion. And in some ways, I feel like that. How I feel when I hear that, it inspires me to want to be more compassionate. And it also gives me some tools for thinking about how to do that.
Dr. McGonigal, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about Susan Loeb and her project related to compassion.
Yeah, so this is an example I sometimes share with people who have sort of preconceptions about who is and isn't compassionate and who can benefit from compassionate service. So Susan Loeb, she actually is a researcher at Penn State University. She studies nursing, and one of the populations she studied is end-of-life care in prisons. And there are many prisons, you might not know this, where they actually train inmates to become caregivers to their fellow prisoners as they're dying. They are not paid for it. They don't get any special perks for it. But they do it if they feel called to do it, if they want to serve in that way. And they do all of the dirty work. They're changing diapers and they're helping to prepare bodies for burial after passing. They are in there as like psychologists and counselors. They will prepare the dying inmates to maybe talk to a family member for the first time to try to make amends. Anything difficult, anything compassionate you can imagine, they're in there doing it. And one of the things that Susan Loeb found while she was studying this is that, first of all, their acts are as sincere and authentic as anywhere you're going to find in hospice care. That despite the beliefs that a lot of people have, that if you are in prison, you have no heart, that you could neither do this nor benefit from it, that is not the case. And many of these people are lifers themselves. They know they're going to die in prison, and they're in prison because they have killed people. And yet they also are able to serve in this way. One of my favorite quotes from one of her studies was from an inmate who talked about how transformative this experience was for him. He said, "I was a predator, and now I'm a protector." Another one talked about knowing that he wasn't a throwaway object, that he had something to contribute even though he was a lifer and would be in prison for the rest of his life. And the other thing that was really amazing about this research is that even though the inmates were really serving their fellow inmates, they ended up being the recipients of their own compassion. That when you talk to people who are in prison, many of them experience it as incredibly dehumanizing for reasons we don't need to go into. But there's a lot of ways that you can get dehumanized while you are incarcerated. And inmates who took on this role of incredible kindness and humanity started to experience the prison and the system as being less dehumanizing. But it's crazy, right? Because they were the source of it. It was their compassion that allowed them to see their own system, their own environment as more caring. And it's another reason I like to share this example, both to reveal that even if you expect people to not have empathy or compassion, it is quite possible, but also to point out that we are always the recipient of our own compassion, that when we act from compassion, it changes the way that the world responds to us, and it changes the way that we see the world. And that's really that part of that upward spiral of compassion, that it does come back to us, and not always in like pay it back ways, but simply in transforming the literal small environment that we inhabit.
Your story reminds me of an interview we did quite a few decades ago with a gentleman who described himself as the schoolyard bully. And he went on to be in the military and did what he called wet work, which I think describes itself, but he basically was responsible for a lot of deaths. And he said at one point in his life, he was struck by lightning and died, and had been dead for something in the neighborhood of 26 minutes before he came back. And he said he had a whole life review, and it was the most painful thing that had ever happened to him in his life, because all of the people that he caused pain to and their loved ones, he experienced that pain. He said it was just horrific. And after he came back, he went to work in hospice, and he said, I just sit there with people. I just hold their hands. I don't have to say a word. I just listen. Or sometimes we're together silently. And he said, it really did change my life. And I'm guessing that compassion can change people's lives in ways that very few other things can.
Yes. And the remarkable thing about that story is also that he was able to have the self-compassion to not just fall down a darker hole after experiencing that pain. I mean, one of the things that is part of common humanity is recognizing that not only do we all suffer and want to be happy, but we also all cause suffering to different degrees. And sometimes people can end up feeling so much shame about the harm that they've caused, even in small ways, maybe not being the perfect parent, or letting a loved one down, or letting a colleague down, or not succeeding in some way. People can get overwhelmed with shame, with regret, with guilt, in a way that does not allow them to go out and contribute or act from compassion. And it's one of the reasons why self-compassion is as important as compassion for others, because we know that that shame and that guilt is not as motivating as recognizing the common humanity of our own failures and deciding to use any mistakes we might have made as a catalyst for going out and trying to do good in the world. And it's remarkable that he was able to do that.
Dr. McGonigal, we have just a moment left. I wonder if there's a good summary of what we should all take with us going forward regarding compassion.
Well, I like to think of compassion as a response to suffering that relieves more than the intended suffering. That, we might see our child suffering in some way or a stranger suffering in some way, and it motivates us to do something. And what is so amazing about compassion is it just goes beyond that. So when we act from compassion, we experience a warm glow. I mentioned it boosts our immune system. It gives us courage. And anyone who witnesses that act also might be inspired. We know that when people see acts of compassion, they're more likely to feel their own compassionate motivation and go out and do good in the world. And so I think that that's what I would like people to take away from compassion, is that every opportunity that you have to act from compassion, to strengthen compassion, or even just celebrate and savor compassion that you observe, that it is amplifying the benefits of compassion for yourself and for others.
Dr. Kelly McGonigal, thank you ever so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Well, thank you.
You've been listening to Dr. Kelly McGonigal, a health psychologist and lecturer at Stanford University. She offers compassion cultivation training through the Stanford Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. Dr. McGonigal studies how social connection can promote health, happiness, and resilience. Her books include The Willpower Instinct and The Upside of Stress. The Science of Compassion is her 6-CD audio course.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wadarsky is the engineer. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible by Red X Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Extra Care 20 Cream with 20% urea for extra skin protection. The toll-free number is 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
If you would like to buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, here's the number to call, 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1104. That phone number, 800-732-2334, or you can also place your order online at peoplespharmacy.com.
And when you visit our website, you can share your thoughts on today's show. Is there a time when compassion made a difference in your life? We'd like to hear about it.
At the website, you could also sign up for our free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show. Listen at your own convenience or share it with a friend. And we'd certainly appreciate you rating our podcast at iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you subscribe.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you so much for listening today, and please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.